confirmation just 2 hours ago from government today that there will be a period of official state mourning for the last apartheid president F.W. de Klerk, with flags to fly at half-mast. De Klerk died last week at the age of 85. You'll have seen the debate around him. He was a person who was at the top of the apartheid system. He's accused of authorizing the execution or murder of anti-apartheid activists, but he also started the process that led our country enjoying democracy and political freedom. He also won a Nobel Peace Prize along with Nelson Mandela. Someone who worked with him and was, in fact, has negotiated the Contessa peace talks that led to our democracy is Roelf Meyer. He joins us now. Mr. Meyer, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. I imagine you must have known F.W. de Klerk for many, many years. Can you remember when you first met him?
I think it was probably around the middle of the 1970s, so it's a pretty long time that I knew him. In fact, decades. So I was not in politics at the time that I met him, and I think he was just a member of parliament of the old apartheid system at that stage. But we came to know each other quite well during the time that followed. Eventually, I was elected as member of parliament by 1979. And he was a minister in government already at that stage.
I mean, you were politically junior to him. How was he seen in the National Party at the time? I mean, people used to talk about verligters, people who were sort of enlightened, and verkrampters, people who were seen as sort of conservative. I mean, where was he seen at that time?
I think he was seen for most of the period that I followed from my entering politics, and that would be end of the 1970s, beginning of 80s. He was seen as a fairly conservative member of the National Party. I think it would be fair to say he was on the right of center equation in those years that followed. But he was also very reasonable in all his approaches. And I think the one thing that distinguished him eventually very clearly from F.W. de Klerk, for instance, is the fact that he was a democratically orientated person, leader. Compared to F.W. de Klerk, who was a security-crat in his whole approach. And I think this is one of the things that F.W. has to get credit for. It's the fact that he realized the moment he became leader of the National Party in 1989, he realized that the system that existed had to be scrapped. It had to be changed. It had to be completely eradicated. And I think it was grown out of his ultimate belief that we needed a democracy in South Africa.
It's interesting to look at the timeline. I mean, by 1984, I think it was, F.W. had said that he would work under a black president. There would be a black president of South Africa in his lifetime. Incredibly controversial thing to say in National Party politics at the time. Then there was, 1989, there was F.W. de Klerk suffered a stroke. There was a sort of cabinet coup. F.W. de Klerk became a leader. As you say, he decided pretty quickly to move towards democracy. Somewhere in that was a conversation with his cabinet, which I imagine you might have been a part of. There would have been a conversation with cabinet before he made that famous speech in 1990. And without cabinet, he couldn't have done it. I mean, what were those meetings like?
Yeah, that's very interesting and very important, Stephen, because by the real decision in terms of what would follow, as far as the announcement of the release of President Mandela and the unbanning of the organizations were concerned, that decision was actually made by December of 1989, more or less 2 months before the announcement. And it was a decision that was made unanimously by cabinet and also, I would say, the top structures of the security departments at the time. I was present. I was fortunate to be present at that stage, and I can say it was a unanimous decision. But it required a leader to take that move, and it was F.W. who was prepared to do that. He was only in position of president of the country at that stage for a period of 3 months, being elected into that by September of '89. So I think this is something that is underestimated in the context of the time. I do a lot of work in conflict situations all over the world. I was just last week in Europe, participating in discussions with regard to a very sensitive conflict situation playing out right now. And if I look at these type of situations, I compare it with where we were in the late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. It was an immense decision by FW, being prepared to immediately after he got the position of president of the country to say, I'm prepared to go into a process of dialogue that would end my presidency. You won't find that anywhere under similar conflict situations.
I mean, a lot was on the line in 1990. I mean, there was a lot of wild talk. There was an organization called the AVB, which has pretty much disappeared, paramilitary organization. The generals within the old South African Defence Force who were used to fighting essentially a war against the ANC and liberation movements, used to going into Mozambique and killing ANC people in another country. They'd done it in Lesotho, they'd done it in Botswana. I mean, there would have been all sorts of risks. There would have been the risk of a coup. There would have been the risk of a military action. There would have been a risk of all kinds of things when F.W. de Klerk made that speech in 1990. And I mean, I think that's why people were so surprised. There was a sense of shock when he said what he said.
It was definitely. It was a complete shock for many. And I think the people who were most surprised were actually the people on the other side, in other words, the leadership of the ANC in exile and so forth. But the point is, and this is the amazing story of South Africa, is that we had at the same time leaders, Mandela and de Klerk, who were prepared to lead their respective support bases into a process of talks, dialogue, and eventually negotiations that brought about a peaceful settlement. And that's why I'm saying this is extraordinary at the time, but also even still now. And that is why the South African peace process, the process of negotiated settlement, is still a benchmark in the world, wherever we go. Whether it's on our continent, and just compare now what is unfolding in Sudan and Ethiopia and so forth, what is unfolding in the Middle East on an ongoing basis. Places like Myanmar, where I'm doing some work, all over, it's South Africa's case that leads us to present it as a benchmark of what can be done to resolve conflict.
During the negotiations, so you were the lead negotiator for the sort of former government. In a way, I suppose you reported to him. I mean, depending on which version of history one believes, and Mr. Meyer, you'll know it better than the rest of us. You and Cyril Ramaphosa, now our president, were negotiating. He was representing the ANC. He would have been reporting back to his principals. You, I presume, were reporting back to de Klerk. How active, how involved was he in the negotiations? I mean, there were moments when only he would have had the authority to agree to certain things, and there would have been moments when maybe he left you to it for a while.
Well, as a principal, he was a fantastic leader. I can say it without a doubt and without qualification. I was, like you say, fortunate to be in that position of reporting to him as the chief government negotiator at the time. And it happened that when there was a complete breakdown in the negotiations in the middle of the process, actually, by mid-1992, after the Boipatong massacre, it was President Ramaphosa in that capacity as chief negotiator for the ANC and myself who had to pick up the straws. And it was an impossible situation. If I just think back at it, it was, goosebumps come back to my immediate experience. But we somehow found a way to resolve the conflict, found a way to take ourselves forward, and within a question of a few months, we had the result. But it was because we had direct access to our principals, Cyril to President Mandela and myself to FW. And as a result of that, we could find a way forward. And 3 months later, they signed an agreement, which was basically the settlement for the South African conflict, known as the Record of Understanding, signed by Mandela and de Klerk, and that set the base for a peaceful settlement or peaceful transition in South Africa.
South Africa's changed a lot since then, Mr. Meyer. I don't need to tell you that. It's moved from what was really a transition period, in some ways quite a long transition period, to a process of transformation, which is very different. Sometimes more difficult, I think, for people to accept transformation. There's been a lot of criticism for de Klerk. And I mean, I understand why. There was that famous interview he did where he refused to accept that apartheid was a crime against humanity. And this became an issue which was brought up time and time again. Mac Maharaj suggested on Thursday, in the hours after de Klerk's passing, after his death, that maybe de Klerk got the idea of transition, but couldn't quite accept transformation. It was almost a step too far, as Mac Maharaj put it. He could cross one Rubicon towards the end of apartheid, but couldn't cross the other Rubicon towards the sort of new, transformed South Africa. Everyone's used the phrase complex legacy to sort of sum it up. I mean, how would you sum up de Klerk? I mean, he's a difficult person to sum up in some ways.
Yeah, he was obviously very deeply rooted in the background of Afrikaner nationalism. If you look at his whole history, where his father and his grandfather and his whole roots were coming from, and I think, it is something that one has to understand to fully appreciate the context. But my assessment of the point that you're raising is that I think he made the right decisions when it came to making or being called upon to make those decisions. I'm talking about 2 February 1990. I'm talking about the referendum that he called in 1992 to assure the majority of white support for the process of change. And there were other moments also that he made very critical, correct decisions. But my assessment is that he made it out of a practical or pragmatic assessment of the situation. Whether he was, in fact, deeply rooted into that decision is a different question. And I've often distinguished in my own public pronouncements on this between the need for a pragmatic change or a paradigm shift, which is deeper and goes beyond just a pragmatic shift. And I think that the question of a paradigm shift is what is really deeply required in the process of change like we have gone through in South Africa and in other situations as well. It's something that I try to share in my advice with others in the country, and that is that unless leaders come to that deep-rooted paradigm shift, which goes beyond just an intellectual mindset or mind shift, I think it's difficult to accept the consequences fully. And maybe there's a vague area here as far as FW is himself concerned, but he did the right thing when it was required. And I think that is what we should be grateful about.
Roelf Meyer, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate the memory of that time as well. Important conversation around our past.